In Hilchos Maisa Karbonos, the Rambam rules, Hanoider Godel, if someone made a vow to bring something of a bigger type, Vehevi Katan, and he brought a smaller one, Lo Yotza, he's not Yotza his neder. On the other hand, if he vowed to bring something smaller and he brought something bigger, then he is Yotza. For example, says the Rambam, if a person said he's going to bring a carbon oil or a carbon shlomim, and he's going to bring it as a keves, a lamb, and instead he brings an ayil, which is a ram. Or he had vowed to bring a calf, and instead he brought an ox. If he vowed to bring a kid, a younger goat, and he brings a goat, then in all these cases he's Yotze. The source for this Rambam is, as the Kesef Mishnah points out, this is a Mishnah in Masechta Menachos, where it says, if a person made a vow to bring something bigger, and he brought something smaller, then everyone would agree that he's not Yotze. On the other hand, if someone vowed to bring something smaller and he brought something bigger, we have a machloikas. According to the Rabbanon, he is Yotze. According to Rebbe, he's not Yotze. The Rambam is clearly paskening like the Rabbanon. Now, the Rambam brings the examples of someone making a vow to bring a lamb and instead he brought a ram, or a calf and brought an ox, a kid and he brought a goat, because the Rambam is ruling that when we say that if you vow to bring something smaller and instead you brought something bigger, you're Yotze, that's only when both of them are at least the same min, they're the same type, the same species, but not if it's going to be two different types. So it's only in our cases, he vowed to bring the younger one of the kind, and he's bringing the older one of the same kind, which is called by a different name, but it's still the same kind. As the Rambam explicitly says this later in the Perek. The Rebbe asks, we need to understand, why should one be Yotze with a ayil, with a ram, if he clearly said that he's going to bring the carbon or oil or a shlomim, he's going to bring a keves, he's going to bring a lamb, and so to the other cases. The Pasuk says, Moitzas vasecha tishmoir, you need to guard, you need to keep, observe what you have uttered with your mouth. V'asisa kasher nadarta, you need to do as you have vowed. Since this person had said he's going to bring a smaller kind, for example, the keves, the lamb, so he needs to fulfill the neder, as the Pasuk says, V'asisa kasher nadarta, you should do what you have vowed. So when you are bringing the bigger one of that kind, the ayil, the ram, instead of the keves, the lamb, you didn't do what you have promised. So generally speaking, there's two ways of viewing this, seemingly. One would be based on the person. That is, when a person makes a neder, when a person makes a vow for something smaller, we're assuming that what he really had in mind was not necessarily to bring a small one, and specifically not a big one. Rather, what he's speaking about is, what he meant was not smaller than. In other words, he was giving a minimum. He meant that at least he's going to bring a small one. And therefore, when he brings a bigger one, he has fulfilled his vow, because that was sort of included in what he had in mind. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is what we call the cheftza, the item, the object. That is, yes, on the one hand, the person said, and he even meant, a small one. For example, the lamb instead of the ram. But since we know that included in a bigger amount is automatically going to be the smaller amount as well, like a concept of yesh bechlal mosai money included in 200, there's also 100. So when you're bringing that bigger one, for example, you're bringing the ram instead of the lamb, so the bigger one includes the smaller one. It's just that you're adding even more within your neder, and therefore we could say your neder was fulfilled. But the Rebbe is not happy with both of these approaches. The Rebbe says this is not enough. And the reason for this, the Rebbe says, because we have a similar machloikas earlier on in the Mishnah in regarding bringing a mincha, regarding bringing a meal offering, a flour. So just before we get into what the Mishnah says, just a general point, which is not brought directly in the Sicha, but just to explain. So generally a mincha is brought from a certain amount of flour, a certain amount of isroinis. Isroin is a certain quantity, and usually the maximum for a mincha would be 60 isroinis. So if a person says, I know I have promised to bring a specific amount of Yisroinos for the mincha, but I don't remember, I don't know how many I actually promised. The first opinion is that he needs to bring the maximum, 60 Yisroinos. Rebbe says he has to do this differently. He has to bring as many Yisroinos as there would be from 1 till 60. Meaning to say, he has to bring one mincha with one Yisroin of flour. He has to bring another Yisroin with another mincha with 2 Yisroinis of flour. And so on until the final one is made up of 60 Yisroinis of flour. What's the reason for this argument? So the Gemara brings a number of opinions. And finally, the Gemara brings the opinion of Rav Ashi, which says that their machloikas is actually the machloikas of if you promised to bring something smaller and you brought something bigger, are you yaitza? That's the machloikas over here between the Rabbanon, which they say that if you promise something smaller and you brought something bigger, you are yaitza. So therefore, let's say a person would have promised 3 Yisroinos and he brought 5. They would say you're yaitza. And therefore, they're telling us over here, bring the full amount of 60, and either way, you're for sure going to be yaitza. Whereas Rebbe says, no, you're not yaitza with something bigger or more than what you promised, and therefore you need to make sure you actually brought the one you promised. And that's why you're going to go through between 1 and 60. One of them is for sure going to be right. The Gemara then continues and asks, usually when we find a similar machloikas in 2 things, the question then is why we need to say both of them. So the Gemara asks, we have this machloikas already once, the Mishnah that says that if a person promised to bring something smaller and he brought something bigger, the first opinion is that you're yaitza. And Rebbe says you're not yaitza, so why do we need this second machloikas regarding to these Yisroinos of flour? So the Gemara says tzricha. Tzricha means that we need each one of the machloikas, and had we not said machloikas in one case, we wouldn't have realized that the machloikas would still apply in the other case as well. How so? If it would just say it in the case of menachos, of the amounts of flour, we could have thought that perhaps the chachamim in this particular case are saying you're yaitza by bringing that one big mincha of the 60 Yisroinis of flour, because no matter how much flour you're bringing, the amount that's going to be put on the mizbeach is always the same. One koim, it's one handful of flour. Whether you're bringing a bigger mincha with more flour or smaller, the amount that goes on the mizbeach is always the same. But in the case, and that's why they would say you're yaitza, because there's no real difference to how much is going on the mizbeach. But in the case of the karbonos, a bigger one or a smaller one, well, clearly a bigger one, there's going to be more parts of the animal that are being brought on the mizbeach. Therefore, maybe in that case, the chachamim, the Rabbanon, would agree to Rebbe, and they would say, you're not yaitza, since there's these more parts of the mizbeach, and you might say that that's not what he vowed, that's not what he had promised. So maybe the Rabbanon in that case would say, you're not yaitza, because now there's so much more that you're burning on the mizbeach. Says the Gemara, what about if it would say the machloikas only? So that's what, going back for a second, so that's why the Chachamim need to say in that case as well, that no, they argue there as well. In other words, they argue that they say that you are yaitza, even though there is more being burnt on the mizbeach. Now going back, what about if it would only say by the karbonos, the bigger and the smaller, that the machloik, that the Chachamim and Rebbe are arguing? So then the argument would have gone the other way. You would have said that Rebbe agree. In other words, if it would only say by karbonos, you would say, yes, it's all very nice, and karbonos where Rebbe is arguing. Again, for the same reason, because there's more being burnt on the mizbeach, so maybe that's why Rebbe is saying that you're not yaitza. But perhaps over here, by the case of the menachos, of the flour offerings, since bottom line is you're just bringing the same handful of flour on the mizbeach, maybe here, Rebbe would agree to the chachamim that you're yaitza, and that's why we need to be told that here too, Rebbe argues. But going back for a minute, in order to understand now how this proved anything, says the Rebbe, what did we say, why it is that we would have thought that the Chachamim would agree to Rebbe in the case of the karbonos? We said the Chachamim would agree that he shouldn't be yaitza, We said the reason is because there's more being offered up on the Mizbeach in the bigger animal than the smaller animal. And we could then say that's not what he promised. Now, the actual fact that we're saying that this would have been the logic, the natural logic of the Chachamim, and we don't argue back and say, but 1 second, if he's giving more, then obviously he's included even the less. So why should the Chachamim say that he's not Yoitze? Therefore, says the Rebbe, it's very difficult to say that in the end result, that is in fact the whole Chidush in why you are being Yoitze if you set a smaller one and you're bringing a bigger one, because included in the bigger one is the smaller one, says the Rebbe. It's very difficult to say that that's the whole point of the Chachamim. Because again, it seems the way the Gemara is understanding it, that the natural way of the main way of understanding would be that if you're bringing more, this is totally not what you have promised. Now, going back to the other way of understanding, that the point of the Machloikas, to say that the Chidush of that Machloikas was that the Chachamim say, because the Chidush is in the Gavra, what we suggested before, that we say that when a person says more, he probably, when a person says less, he probably has in mind that this is the minimum, but really he would be happy to give even more, says that again, this is very difficult to say. Because practically what he said was something completely different. How can you say that he meant something else? The Rebbe says we also need to understand, according to both ways of looking, whether we're saying that it's the person was only limiting himself to the minimum, and therefore there's no problem if he gives more. Or we should explain it based on the idea that included in the bigger amount is the smaller amount, and that's why no problem about giving more. The Rebbe says, according to both of these ways, it would then make sense to say that if you promise the smaller one, you should be lechatchila allowed to bring the bigger one. Because, as we just said, when you said the smaller one, you anyways meant the bigger one. And when you said when you bring the bigger one, it also includes the smaller one, so why not lechatchila be able to bring the bigger one? Furthermore, the Rebbe says, since we know that a person that really wants to have merits, the best thing is to break a Yetzer Hara and to try to give as much as possible. When you bring a carbon, you're supposed to bring from the very best of that specific type. As the Torah says, that Hevel brought from the very best of his sheep and from their fats. The Pasuk also says, Kol Chelev La Hashem. You should always bring the best to Hashem. Regarding karbanos, we say, Mivchan Nedereichim. You should always give the very, very choicest of your vows. So if we should say these above mentioned svaros, then seemingly what should have come out is that if you made a neder of a smaller one, then lechatchila you should bring the bigger one. Or at least it's better to bring the bigger one because of this idea. Should always be giving the best. But in the simple reading of the Rambam where he says that if you vowed for a smaller one and you brought a bigger one, you're yoitza. And not even as he says later when it comes to nedovis, to donations, where he says something similar to the Mishnah, that if you brought a sheep and it became possible, then if you want, you could bring a ram. But here he just says, if you brought a ram, you're yoitza. It sounds like it's not a din lechatchila, it's not the best thing to do. It's only b'di'evid you were yoitza. But again, based on the previous logic that we said, you should have even lechatchila, maybe even you should dafka try to bring the bigger one. Now the Rebbe contrasts this first with a different case, and the Rebbe says why it's different. In regards to a carbon oil v'yoyred. Now, oil v'yoyred is that for certain averos, for 4 specific averos, the Torah tells us that if you could afford it, you bring a bigger animal. If you can't afford it, then you bring some birds. And if you can't even afford that, you bring some flour. So in regards to that, the Sefer HaChinuch says that if you're poor and you bring the sheep or the goat, you're actually not yoitza. If you bring more than you could afford. The reason is because since Hashem had compassion on you and said that you don't need to bring this bigger one, it's sort of not right that you're sort of pushing yourself to bring more than what you can afford. If Hashem is telling you to bring something else, then why are you acting differently? But the Rebbe says that cannot be applied to our case at all. Because there we're speaking about the types of karbanis that, number one, the Torah is the one that obligated you in a certain kind of carbon, not that you decided, you made a vow to bring it. And therefore you can say if the Torah obligated in one thing, don't try to bring something else. Number two, the karbonos of the rich and the poor person are actually different types of things. One is animals, another one is birds, and the very poor people are bringing flour. But back in our case, where we're speaking about a carbon that's coming because you promised to bring the carbon, and again, generally, as we said, the Rambam is speaking about it's in the same type of animal, so therefore this whole idea wouldn't apply, and therefore, again, seemingly, we should even lechatchila be able to bring the bigger one. Which tells us that when a person didn't make that neder for a small one, we don't say, oh, it automatically meant a bigger one as well. That's what he had in mind. Or about the object of the carbon, that we should say that the bigger one automatically includes the smaller one. What about the idea that we mentioned before, Yesh B'chlal Mosai Yimana, that when you say 200, automatically it includes 100? The Rebbe says it's very different. 200 includes 100. That's a practical thing. That's a metzius. That's the way it is. In other words, inside of 200, you'll always have the 100. Whereas in our case, if you're bringing an ox, there is no calf right now. You're only bringing the ox, not the calf. If so, says the Rebbe, we're back to square one, back to the original question. What is the reason of the din that if you promised a smaller one and you brought a bigger one, you're yotze? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand all of this by first looking carefully at the wording of the Rambam in its caption to the halachis of Nedarim. The Rambam says, "Sheyishmar moitzas vasav," you should observe what you have uttered with your mouth. V'yaseh k'moshe nadar, and do what you promised, what you vowed. Now, seemingly, this seems just to be a little bit of an extra wording over here, and almost redundant, just repeating himself. In fact, says the Rebbe, in the minyan ha-mitzvahs, in the count, and all the way in the beginning of the whole Rambam, the Rambam just says, you should fulfill whatever you uttered. Because there, the Rambam is just speaking very, very briefly. Now, although it's true that what the Rambam says over here in the caption is very similar and based on the Pasuk, the Pasuk says, Moitzas vasecha tishmor v'yosisa ka'asher nadarta. And the Rambam style in the Sefer Hayad is to use and copy the words of Psukim. Nevertheless, says the Rebbe, it's a little bit doichik to say, it's a little hard to say that he would use all of these expressions if there's absolutely no relevance in halacha of this redundant and double expression. Says the Rebbe, so it makes sense to say that it's not just repeating himself in different words, but rather these are like two different dinim, two different obligations. There's one that he needs to keep the words that he had uttered with his mouth, like the pasuk says, Moitzos vasecha tishmor. And the other one is what the Rambam says, you should do what you have vowed, as the pasuk says, V'yosiso ka'asher nadarta. What are these two different things? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, in every neder there are two ideas. There are the words that he had actually spoken, and then there is the content, the essence, the theme of what he was trying to say, the neder. And these are really the two ideas in the pasuk. Number one, moitzas vasecha tishmor, you need to keep the words that you have uttered, the words that you have said, that you have verbalized. Then there's v'yasisa ka'asher nadarta, you need to fulfill the idea behind the neder. Says the Rebbe, based on this we can now understand the machloikas between Rebbe and Rabbanon. In the case of if a person made that vow for the smaller one, and he brought the bigger one, of whether he's yotze or not. This is all how connected to how we understand this obligation of doing what you have vowed. Vasisa kasher nadarta. Again, we have two things. There's moitzas vasecha tishmor, you have to keep what you said with your mouth, and there's vasisa kasher nadarta, keeping the theme of the neder. Rebbe says we only consider what you have actually said, moitzas vasecha, the words you said. When it comes to the toichen, to the idea of the neder, kasher nadarta, that's always going to be defined by the words that you have said. So we always stick to the exact words that you said. Where is the Rabbanan hold? That the main thing is actually v'yasisa kasher nadarta. The main thing is to keep the idea, the theme, the spirit of the neder, even if it's not so much exactly fitting with the words that he ended up saying. In other words, that the neder is not exact. In other words, the main thing is keeping the neder. The idea of if it doesn't fit exactly with the words, that doesn't hold back from the fact that you're still fulfilling your neder. The Rebbe actually says that this fits very much with what we find in a number of places of Shas, machloikas in between Rebbe and Rabbanon, regarding words that are used in Torah or Divrei Chazal or the way people speak. We find in a number of places this same kind of machloikas. The Rebbe is often going with the idea that we always take it literally, and with all the details, we look at words exactly as they say, that's the way we're going to translate them. Whereas the Rabbanon hold that it doesn't necessarily always have to be the very literal wording and all the details, if at least it's fitting the general content and theme of what's going on. The Rebbe has discussed this in other sichas more at length. Applying this now in our case, when a person says he's going to bring a smaller one and he brings a bigger one, he said he's going to bring a lamb and he brought a ram. So if we look at moitzas vasecha, if we look at the exact words that he said, well, he said, I'm going to bring a keves, a lamb, which definitely does not mean a ram and it doesn't include a ram. But if we look at the toichen haneder, the idea of what he was saying, he's making a neder to Hashem. And when you make a neder to Hashem, we have the general command that we're supposed to bring the very, very best to Hashem. So therefore we say that the theme of his neder is to bring to Hashem something from this type, from this species, from tzoin, from sheep. The fact that he verbalized the word keves, which is the younger ones of the sheep, the lamb, that's just a technical side point or side issue because he couldn't afford something more, so he mentioned the smaller one. But what did he mean when he said keves? He mainly meant that he's going to bring something from the species, from the type of sheep. And therefore, according to the Rebbe, that we just look at the actual words he said, moitzas vasecha, bottom line is, if you brought a big one instead of the small one, you're not going to be yotze. Because your neder, your vow, was for the small one, so you cannot be yotze, your neder, by bringing a carbon which is different to what you have said, even if it's bigger. According to the Rabbanon, however, we're looking mainly at the content of his neder, v'asiso kasher nadarta, and therefore, yes, even though lechatchila, we don't say that he should bring the bigger one, the ram instead of the sheep, which is one of the questions we asked before, why not lechatchila? Because bottom line is the Torah did say moitzas vasecha tishmer, you should keep to what you said, so lechatchila you should stick to the words you said. But if you did bring a big one, you brought the ram, Chachamim will say, you still fulfilled v'asiso kasher nadarta. You still fulfilled the theme of your neder, the content of your neder, and therefore you did fulfill the mitzvah of the Torah, because again, the idea of moitzas vasecha tishmer, to stick to exact your words, according to the Chachamim, that's not li'ikuva, that wouldn't hold you back from being yotze. Says the Rebbe, we could make this even more geschmack, the psak of the Rambam, that again, that you are yotze if you promise a small one and you bring a big one, which is the opinion of the Chachamim, the Rabbanon. We could make this even more geschmack by first prefacing another point. By this mitzvah saseh of the Torah, that the Rambam says a person has to fulfill his neder, whether it's what's called nidrei isur, so we have two types of vows. Nidrei isur means when a person is taking a vow where he is saying something is going to be forbidden to me, or nidrei hektish, when he's promising to give something to Hashem. These are two types of nedarim. The Rambam says the mitzvahs obviously you have to keep both. And the Rambam brings two different psukim. One pasuk, moitzas vasecha tishmor v'asiso kasher nodarto, which is the pasuk we've been discussing. And another pasuk, kechol hayotzim mipiv yasa, whatever comes out of your mouth you should do. The Rebbe says the difference between these two psukim are, moitzas vasecha tishmor v'asiso kasher nodarto is clearly speaking about the nedarim of hektish, where a person is donating something to Hashem. The pasuk kechol hayotzim mipiv yasa is a pasuk speaking about nidrei isur, when a person made a prohibition on himself on a particular item. The Rebbe says we see this in the Rambam himself, in his count of mitzvahs in the beginning of Sefer Hayad, where he brings the pasuk moitzas vasecha tishmor v'asiso. There he says that the mitzvah is that a person should fulfill what he had said regarding a carbon or regarding tzedakah and the like. He doesn't mention nidrei isur because that pasuk again is only speaking about promises that he makes to Hashem, what he's going to donate. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand the difference in the wording of these psukim based on what we said before of this idea that there's moitzas vasecha, there's the idea of keeping to your words, and there's also keeping to the neder, to the theme, to the idea behind your neder. So the Rebbe says like this. Regarding nidrei isur, regarding when a person makes something forbidden to himself, which pasuk did we just say applies? Only the pasuk kechol hayotzim mipiv yasa. Do what you have said. Whereas by Nidrei Hekdesh, the Nedarim where you're promising to giving something to Hashem, we said there's two details. To keep what you said, and V'yosisa kasher nadarta, in other words, what you verbalized, and V'yosisa kasher nadarta, and stick to your neder. Why the difference between which psukim are applied to each one? The difference between Nidrei Isser and Nidrei Hekdesh is, by Nidrei Isser, when you are making something forbidden on yourself, the whole Isser is completely dependent only on your words. It's completely based on your words. Without your words, there is no Isser. And that's why, by Nidrei Isser, there's going to be only one obligation. You have to stick to the words you said. Whatever you said, that's what you have to stay away from. Since it's only your words that created the prohibition. Whereas by Nidrei Hekdesh, what is the neder doing? When you're making the vow, you're just saying there is a concept in Metzias, a concept of a korban to Hashem, or tzedakah, etc. This is a real Metzias al pi Torah. You are saying that right now, this, through your vow, you're making that this should right now apply to yourself, to the animal, etc. In other words, you're not creating a new, like in the case of an Isser, you created a new Isser. Here you're just making it apply in this particular case. The Rebbe says, we discussed this actually once at length, there's another whole Sicha where the Rambam says in the end of Hilchos Nedarim, that Amru Chachamim, the Chachamim said, Kol HaNoider, a person that just makes vows, if a person makes a vow, the Rambam is saying it's not a very good thing. It's Kilu Bona Bama, it's as if you built a Bama. Which obviously one is not allowed to build a Bama. And if a person did go ahead and made a neder, the Rambam says it's a mitzvah to try to nullify, to ask, to go to a chacham and to nullify the neder, so that it shouldn't end up being a stumbling block. But when does this apply, says the Rambam? That's only a nidrei isser in something that you had made forbidden to yourself. But nidrei hektish, if you had taken a promise to bring something to Hashem, then it's a mitzvah to fulfill it. You shouldn't try to get a heter for it, unless you have absolutely no choice. As the pasuk says, "Nedorai la Hashem hashalim," I will pay my nedorim to Hashem. Why the difference? So the Rebbe says, because by nidrei hekdesh, so what had you caused? You had caused not that you didn't create the whole idea. In other words, again, there's something in the Torah, korban or tzedakah, etc., and you apply that now to this particular situation, to this particular, in other words, right now it became a mitzvah. And that's why you don't go ahead and try to undo it, because it became something very, very real that applies according to the Torah. Where again, the other case, the whole thing was just based on your words. And therefore the Rambam suggests that rather you should try to ask for a heter, etc. So now going back to our case. So by nidrei hektish, according to the Rambam, which paskins according to the Rabbanon, we have this din of yosiso kasher nodarta. In other words, it's not only about the words that you verbalized, but also that you fulfill the neder, even if you just generally carried out the content, the point, the theme of the neder. Whether it's a korban to Hashem, whether it's tzedakah, etc., and you're carrying it out, you're fulfilling it, even if it's not exactly as moitzes fasecha as the words that you have verbalized. The Rebbe now turns to Pnimi Yisonyanim, the explanation of Pnimi Yisonyanim. The Rebbe says we know that korban is from the word of kiruv, bringing close. The idea of korbanis is, as it says, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban la Hashem, the korban needs to come from yourself, the Yid himself becoming close to Hashem. He's bringing close his own faculties, his own senses, his own talents, bringing everything to Hashem. Says the Rebbe, and this is a major difference between korbanos and all other mitzvahs. We know that the mitzvahs are called, like the Eivorim, the 248 mitzvahs Hasei are called like the 248 limbs, and the 365 mitzvahs Lois Hasei, they are the 365 veins or sinews. So every single mitzvah is one of these Eivorim or Giddim. We know a mitzvah is mitzvah meloshen tzavsa v'chibur, it's about an attachment. So in every mitzvah you're connecting a particular Eiver, a particular Gid, a particular part of yourself with Hashem. On the other hand, korbanos, the whole point of a korban is that Yid is giving himself away completely to Hashem. All of him is becoming close to Hashem. The Rebbe says this also fits. very much and emphasized according to the way the Ramban explains the reason of how korbanos bring atonement. Because a person is supposed to be thinking when he brings the korban, he's supposed to be thinking that he had sinned to Hashem with his nefesh and his guf, and really he deserves that his blood should be spilled and that he should be burnt. If not for the kindness of Hashem, that Hashem is taking this exchange, the blood of the korban, and therefore that blood should be instead of his blood, that the life or soul of that animal should be instead of his. So the korban is instead of his own guf and nefesh, because that's really what a korban is. A korban is about a person giving himself over completely, body and soul, to Hashem. Furthermore, the idea of korbanos, the content of korbanos, is usually the idea of tshuva, understood also from this Ramban that we just mentioned. And tshuva we know is higher than all the mitzvahs, and that's why tshuva is the one that can fix all the blemishes and fill all of those damages and blemishes that happen as a result of doing aveiros or lack of doing a mitzvah saseh. Says the Rebbe, this is one of the reasons why Parshas HaKarbonos starts off with the karbonos that come as a neder and a dove, as a vow, as a gift, as a donation. As Rashi says, right in the beginning of the parsha, the karbonos and the dove dibring, and the Torah is speaking about the karbonos that are coming as a donation. And only later does the Torah continue with the karbonos of achatos and an asham, the karbonos that are an obligation. Why? Because since the idea of a carbon is that a yid is becoming close to Hashem, completely close to Hashem, this is mainly going to be expressed not so much in the karbonos that come as an obligation. When something is coming as an obligation, what you're mainly feeling is, the Eibishter commanded you to bring something, whether it's a chatos or an asham for a particular aveira. So you don't feel this idea so much that the person is trying to get closer to Hashem. It's only in a carbon of nedava where you can feel this idea that the yid on his own is trying to bring himself close to Hashem. Says the Rebbe, according to all of this, we can now explain our halacha of one making a neder for something small, and he brings something bigger, is yoitza. When a yid vows to bring a carbon, what's the inner content of that? It's not only that he's coming to fulfill a specific mitzvah, or that would be like we said, moitzes vasecha tishmor, you have to keep what you said. But really, there's a more general idea over here. He's bringing himself closer to the Eibishter, completely giving himself over to the Eibishter. As the Razal actually say, in regards to the carbon mincha of a nedava, that the Torah uses then there the term nefesh. The nefesh is going to bring the carbon mincha. Hashem says, who is usually the one that brings a mincha, a gift, a carbon of flour? It's usually going to be a poor person. Hashem says, this is why it says nefesh. Hashem says, I count it. My law of Hashem is counting it as if he gave up his very nefesh to me. Says the Rebbe, this idea when we say Mailan Yolov, the Rebbe is saying this is being said in a positive way. That it is being given also the koyach from above. To be makriv his nefesh, to actually be giving over his nefesh, and in other words, that's even going to be more than he could manage on his own. The Eibishter is going to help him out over here, the Eibishter is going to count it as the Eibishter is helping him to be elevated to a much higher level than he would be able to elevate himself. And therefore, says the Rebbe, the fulfillment of the specific mitzvah over here is being included in the more general idea of being connected to the Eibishter in a general way of Yidden to the Eibishter through donating and bringing these karbonos. And therefore, what's mainly important over here is the general content, the fact that the Yid is giving himself away and therefore becoming closer to Hashem completely. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand this expression of koton and gadol, spiritually speaking. In the beginning of the avodah, Yid is actually on a lower level. He's in a level of koton. Since, however, it's connected to the idea of karbonos, with becoming completely given over to Hashem and bringing of himself, so therefore, it's really a kiruv and a carbon of all of him. That's why we're calling it gadol. The Rebbe says this is similar to what's explained regarding yirat Hatah or Kabbalah, so the lower level of fear. But really, even if you're starting that lower level, it's connected always with the highest level of yira. And therefore, says the Rebbe, even though you may have been starting off on a lower level, but really, vehevi gadol, it brings that the Yid should completely give himself over in a great way, in a big way, that even Begilu, in a revealed way, with all of his koiches, he becomes completely close to Hashem. And the Rebbe says through being involved and learning the Torah of the karbonos, then it's ki'ilu ikar of carbon, it's as if we brought the karbonos. And it says when Talmidei Chachamim are involved in the halachas of avodah, Maila aleim hakasuv, as if the Beis HaMikdash was built in their days, and from the Ke'ilu, we get to the building of the Beis HaMikdash B'Poyel, the Vias Mashiach Tzidkeinu, and there we'll be able to be makriv the karbonis practically, and even more than that. As it says, Nakar l'fanecha k'mitzvah tzitzanecha will bring the karbonis in the best possible way. The Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi she'ibane b'meheirev yameinu mamash.